Palestinian prisoners have been freed from an Israeli jail and now have arrived in Ramallah in the West Bank. Let me show you some of the live pictures from Ramallah, because earlier Israel delayed the release in the protest because of the chaotic handover of the hostages in Gaza. So let's go to Wira Davis. He is there watching these events and huge crowds there. Wira, just take us through what you've been seeing over the last, half an hour, 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, chaotic but joyous scenes here in Ramallah. All day families have been waiting here to receive their loved ones. Many of them, of course, coming here to Ramallah. About half of those freed today from Israeli jails are expected here in Ramallah tonight. It's been delayed for several reasons, partly in the last hour because of the sheer number of people in Ramallah. Thousands of people have been following the buses, impeding their journeys slightly as they come here. But we've had some of the prisoners being carried aloft on people's shoulders in the last 5 or 10 minutes. I've just seen below me what is presumably a wife greeting her husband. We've spoken to several family members. Two girls I spoke to are two young women, aged 21 and 20, who've never seen their father because their mother was pregnant when he was arrested. And those are the kind of scenes that are being repeated across the West Bank tonight. And you can see behind me, they're about to come behind me, two more men being carried aloft in those grey prison uniforms. We don't know how long they've been in jail for, but many people have been in jail for 20 years. Some of the more serious offenders, those convicted of the very serious crimes, are not being allowed by the Israelis to return to the occupied Palestinian territories. They're being sent to exile in either Egypt or other neighbouring countries. But these are the former prisoners now who've been released as part of this deal and will be allowed to remain here in the occupied West Bank. Among some of the high-profile prisoners are some of those who led battalions, for example, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in the West Bank, and they are among those who have been allowed by the Israelis to return to their hometowns and home cities. But this is a joyous occasion. It's been opposed by many on the far Israeli right who don't like the ceasefire. They don't agree with the ceasefire in Gaza because they believe that the Palestinian factions, in particular Hamas, have not yet been defeated. And the scenes that we have witnessed today in Gaza, but also here in the West Bank, will lie very, very difficultly, I think, with some on the Israeli right. Others see it as a necessary evil if the hostages, of course, are to be freed and peace is eventually to return to Gaza. But there's no doubting the uplifting feeling, the joyous scenes among the families of those being released here in the West Bank. As you can see there behind me, another man being carried aloft on the shoulders of his family members.
As you were mentioning it, it is a large number, 110 or so. Some of those people convicted of serious crimes, but also among that group, women and children as well.
Yeah, that's quite right. Now, Israel has labelled all of the prisoners being released as terrorists, but there's no doubt that some of those who've been detained have been detained under what's called administrative detention. They've not been formally charged or convicted of certain offences. Others have been convicted of what some people might regard as relatively minor offences. There are a number of children amongst those being released today. The youngest of them is 15, and as you say, several women. But Israel points out that among the many who've been released, for example, is a man called Zakaria Zubeidi. He's a former leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. He was accused and convicted of sending many people on bombing and murderous missions, which led to the death, the murders of many Israelis. Now, he has been released today. He's been released to his hometown of Jenin here in the occupied West Bank. So Israel points out that it's been a very difficult and painful decision for the Israelis to release people convicted of serious offences. But as you point out, others who are being released today have not actually been convicted at all, have been in administrative detention or are convicted minors, young people and women as well.
Just remind us how we get to a stage where we saw earlier in the day 8 hostages released and this 110, because all the way through the process we've had these equations that are being used to determine the sort of numbers of Palestinian releases. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, there's a quota. It depends who Hamas releases from Gaza. So for every soldier that will be released, there will be a certain number of Palestinian prisoners released. For every civilian hostage release, there would be a certain number of Palestinian prisoners released. Interestingly, the Thai nationals who were released today, they were not part of this equation. So the 5 Thai nationals, or the 4 Thai nationals who were released, there was no Palestinian prisoners released. They were not part of the ceasefire deal. And so every time over the next few days and few weeks, every time a certain number of Israeli hostages are released from captivity in Gaza, a set number of Palestinians will be released from Israeli jails. And that is how we've arrived at this figure of 110 prisoners to be released today. 60 or so of those are being allowed here to the occupied West Bank. A much smaller number are being sent to, or have been sent to, the occupied East Jerusalem. Now, interestingly, you won't see scenes like this in East Jerusalem because that has been annexed and occupied by Israel, and the Israeli authorities in East Jerusalem made it abundantly clear to family members in East Jerusalem that they would not tolerate any celebratory scenes there of their family members being released. A much smaller number are being released into Gaza itself, and as I say, about 21 Palestinian prisoners, those convicted of the most serious offences, are not being allowed by Israel to remain in the Palestinian territories at all. They've been sent to Egypt and may end up in other Arab nations.
I'll ask you another few questions in a moment or two, but I wonder if your cameraman can just swing around to give us just a better idea of the scenes all around you, and perhaps you can describe what we're actually seeing, because all of those streets and square looked absolutely packed with Palestinians welcoming home those people who've been released.
You're quite. This is one of the municipal buildings in the centre of Ramallah, the main Palestinian city in the occupied West Bank. It's where most of the returning prisoners are being brought. Now, these people you see being paraded on our camera should have been here several hours ago, but because of the Israeli decision to postpone and delay this release because of the chaotic scenes in Gaza, and also because of the sheer weight of supporters and family members clogging the roads on the way into Ramallah, this is only just happening now. And I think, to be honest, this was pretty much expected. We spoke to some family members who weren't overly concerned by the delays because they expected delays. One woman told me she had been here last week because she'd been led to believe that her father was among the prisoners to be released in the first tranche of prisoners to be released. That wasn't the case. So she came here this morning from Nablus in the northern part of the West Bank. She was dressed in traditional Palestinian costume. It was the second time in 2 weeks she'd put on that costume to welcome home her father. So she wasn't too bothered by the fact there would be a delay of a couple of hours because she was going to meet her father after 20 years. So chaotic scenes, but relatively peaceful scenes. There's been no trouble, no violence, just overexcited people and very happy people here to meet those people who've been released from prison, many of them having been there for many, many years.
As you mentioned, as we've seen these exchanges, this of course the third, there has been huge criticism, resignations in part from Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government. Do you think as we see more of these exchanges, it is making the process harder or easier to get to the next stage?
That's a really, really good question. The initial ceasefire, phase one, is meant to last for 6 weeks. We're about 2 or so weeks into it now. The negotiations are meant to start on Monday for the next phase of the ceasefire. And there's a lot of concern that we might not even get that far because, first of all, it's a very fragile and very tense ceasefire. We've seen today the scenes in Gaza, what is happening here annoys many people on the extreme right of Israeli politics who believe that the war should not yet have ended because they see that Hamas is still a fighting force in Gaza. We saw those scenes in Gaza today with heavily armed Hamas fighters making the most of the public opportunity to show that they, in their eyes, are not yet defeated. And that will put pressure on the negotiators from the Israeli side, from the Palestinian side, and more importantly, the international negotiators from the United States, from Egypt and Qatar, to try and keep this momentum going, because there will be a lot of pressure, particularly from the far right of Mr. Netanyahu's government, for us not to go to the next stage of the ceasefire process. There are people like Ministers Smotrich, former Minister Ben Gvir, and their supporters in government who don't want to see the second phase of the ceasefire. They want to stop these kind of scenes, they want to stop the Palestinian prisoner releases, and they want to continue the war against Hamas in Gaza, although of course that would mean that any remaining hostages in Gaza would remain in captivity as well.
And we're at that second phase. We were told negotiations for that second phase would start in the first phase on day 16, and we're pretty close to that now, aren't we?
That's Monday. Monday of next week. The negotiators are meant to sit around the table, discuss the release plan for the hostages who have not been released, the release of yet more Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. We're then meant to work towards a third phase. And what everybody looking in from the outside says is really needed, and that is some plan for what happens next. Because unless there is a plan for what happens next, a plan to rebuild Gaza, a humanitarian plan for those 2 million people remaining in Gaza, a plan for Israelis to return to their kibbutzes and their homes alongside the Gaza border. Unless there is a plan for the future, many of us who've covered numerous wars in and around Gaza and in the Palestinian territories in the last 20 years fear that we'll be in exactly the same place in the next 5 or 6 years. Whatever's happened to Hamas, whatever's happened to the other Palestinian factions, unless there's a long-term plan for the future of this region, we might be in the same place again in 5 or 6 years' time.